The point of this panel is to now talk from the policy wonk perspective about the findings of this study. So you've already met Celine. Everybody knows EduWonk Andy Rotherham. Your title, what's your title? Partner, co-founder and partner, Bellwether Education Partners. And Dave Driscoll, who is the chair of the National Assessment Governing Board, but even more importantly, he is the chair of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute Board, and he's also on the advisory committee, right, of Teach Plus. So you're a twofer, Dave.
Former commissioner.
Oh, right. And then there was that Massachusetts.
Yeah,
oh, okay. And then, yes, something about Massachusetts, best state in the country, blah, blah, blah. But we'll get to that. Okay. You know, people who've been to these events before know that I try to keep it lively because, again, it's 5 o'clock and we're talking about education. So we will do that. All right, so we just heard great comments from the teachers. And I have to say, my own perspective was that it was not exactly a ringing endorsement for the role that testing is playing in today's schools. Yet many of us have been involved in federal and state reforms that have focused a lot on testing and accountability. So let me just start with the big picture question, which is, why don't we just get rid of the state assessments, right? I mean, remind us again, why? I mean, we keep hearing there's all this time spent on testing and all this pressure, and you know, it's not getting teachers to teach in a positive way, and it's destroying our school cultures. You know, are we at a point where we just need to say, hey, throw that out and let's try something else right now? There's plenty of reformers, Jay Green, for example, I'm thinking about you, who are saying, you know what, it's gone too far, forget about it. So restate the case for why we need these end of the year state exams. Anybody want to take that first?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I mean, we are the test case. I'm sorry. I was going to say I feel like I'm at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting where I have to say I'm David Driscoll. I'm responsible for having kids spend thousands of hours of testing. But clearly, we jumped to the front of the country because of MCAS. I mean, there was thankfully a lot of parts to it, and I do think that many of us need to keep faith with good and great teachers, by the way, and all of the comments that the teachers made are right. I mean, if PARCC and Smarter Balance or any assessment program doesn't account for growth in a fair way, then it's not worth it. If any test doesn't have someone mentioned that it was just raw data. MCAS not only was developed by classroom teachers, but we release the entire test, and we give you the right answers, and we tell you what standard it's related to. And when you get your multiple choice, not only do you get the right answer per classroom, so you know if there's a question on fractions, whether or not 40% of your kids got it right or 80%, we actually give you the raw data that tell you what wrong answer your kids gave, in case there's a pattern there. So all of the comments about the quality of the testing and the concern about PARCC and Smarter Balance, I think we addressed those through MCAS. So it was a very good test.
But to be clear, Dave, you did not give them the answers before the kids took the test.
No, we did not.
Okay, I just want to make
and we
said,
because
that would explain a lot.
And we did what the Common Core does. We set very good standards, again, developed by our teachers. So I think, you know, you set good standards. What is it the kids should know and be able to do? And then you have an assessment program that actually questions that and has ways of assessing it. So I think that's been fine. It's all of the politics. People mention the legislature in Indiana and so forth. I not only blame the current legislators who are running for cover, but I blame the states, many of the states that adopted, the 46 states or whatever it was, that adopted Common Core. There was one state that adopted the new generation science standards the day after they were developed. So states just, without thinking, adopted the Common Core and weren't ready for this pushback. But anyway, to get back to your question, I mean, there's no question in my mind, and there's anecdotal evidence across the board as well as real evidence of how it improved student achievement in Massachusetts, and we really did jump to the front of the country where we had been 7th or 8th in NAEP, and we've been #1 since 2001.
Right. And it has not outlived its usefulness.
Not yet, but there's too much testing, by the way. We test too much, but we'll get back to that.
We'll get back to that. Okay. Celine or Andy, would either of you like to take this up? What the macro case, beyond anything Dave said, for the state testing, for the accountability?
Well, Well, I think there's not a teacher in America who doesn't care about whether or not their students are learning. And so I think at some level, what you heard from all of the teachers is I'd like to know where my kids are at the start of the year, and I'd like to know where they are at the end of the year. I wake up every morning motivated to help them succeed, and I want some indicator. There are multiple indicators that matter. One is, are they learning math and ELA?
But you don't have to necessarily attach all the stakes to that test that we are, right? So, I mean, where I'm going a little bit is to say, okay, we're not getting rid of the state assessments, yet everybody says we do like diagnostic assessments, right? But it can't be, it's not much use if you only do it once a year, right?
Well, and I think, this goes back to where we were in Massachusetts relative to many other states around the country, setting a very high bar, saying, 10th grade students really need to pass something that's close to a 10th grade test, whereas other states kind of were saying 10th grade students need to pass something close to a 6th grade test. I don't think that's fair for kids. I don't think that is going to help us as a society. And so we need some kind of bar for, so we don't fail kids and say at the time of college, now you need to pay for remediation and you can't start college coursework.
All right. Now, Andy, some of what we heard in this panel and a lot of what we hear about testing now is the focus on teacher accountability, right? So we're tying these test scores to teacher evaluations. I mean, when you step back a little bit and you think about how everything's playing out in the reform circle, was that a mistake? I mean, do you think that we rushed into that in the reform community and that has warped the way that this whole thing is playing out now?
Well, I mean, you're almost asking down the vein of like, do I still beat my wife? I mean, the answer to both those questions is yes. It's a very leading question. Yes, we rushed into it, and yes, it was necessary.
All right, but not on the wife.
No.
Okay, yes. Okay, Claudio's here from NPR. I just want to make sure. Plus, it's on the way.
Claudia's met my wife. She'd be doing the beating. So both those things are true. And Bellwether, we wrote a paper about this called The Hangover. But that's what happens. And when you have these big policy shifts, you can write that. You could write that about welfare. You could have written that paper in the late '60s about the creation of Medicaid and Medicare and entitlement programs. I mean, that to me is sort of an uninteresting question. The bigger question is how do you hold this labor force accountable in a meaningful way and so forth. And there's a lot of complexities there. I think what's going on here is, so we can talk about Common Core and evaluation, and I actually think the subtext, this whole conversation we're having about Common Core in many ways, like in New York's a great example of this, it's really a conversation about teacher evaluation, right. And sort of it's getting battled out through Common Core. But what it's really about is this question of evaluation. Well, I mean, what you see, and you heard it on that first panel, which was just a great panel. I mean, teachers are understandably frustrated. They are in a low capacity system, and they're at the end of the chain, and so they're dealing with the consequences of that low capacity from the policy community, from within school districts, and then within their schools. And one of the teachers said, I want to teach writing, I want to teach at a high level, but you can have a school administration that's not interested in that, and you can teach at a very low level and still get where you want to go. I mean, those are all examples of a low capacity system, and so I think in the spirit of when we often in this field we talk about one thing when we're really talking about something else. When we talk about testing, what we really need to talk about is just the capacity of the system to do it right or to do it wrong. And we talk as if sort of testing is inherently going to have to be done wrong, as it is in some places. And then we leave out of the conversation, what can it look like when it's done right? And you heard the teachers on this panel, and what Celine just said, talk about how it helps their practice go. Look at an organization like ANET, which is a nonprofit that helps teachers use data and so forth. The teachers who work with them are very enthused in terms of how that helps their work. We've seen that in lots of places. David has examples from Massachusetts. And so the thing I loved about this report is it got us under this sort of averages and so forth, which obscures more than it reveals. And when we ask questions like the question you're asking, you can't ask these questions in sort of in generalities. You have to ask them in much more in specifics, because that's how this stuff plays out.
All right, so we're not going to get rid of state assessments. Okay, and you're pointing to things like ANET, these diagnostic benchmark assessments, formative assessments that people find in many ways very valuable, right? And there's some evidence that they actually can help raise achievement, right? Just the other day, Russ Whitehurst put out a post from Brookings saying we need more testing, not less testing, because it is the frequent assessment of students and then acting on that assessment that raises achievement. Okay, but again, it's those formative assessments that's driving those big numbers in some of your districts.
Well, with due respect, Mike, there's also evidence on sort of summative assessment and accountability, and it's relatively modest, but with due respect, it's not as modest as a lot of the ideas you guys tout around here. And, if you look at it in the context of sort of broad social policy change in the United States, sort of there's evidence that these tests and that kind of accountability for all their problems have also moved the
Yeah,
needle.
no, absolutely. No argument from me there. But I do want to get back to the question about the formative assessments, because it seems like if you want to dramatically shrink time on testing, you'd get rid of those formative assessments. That's where most of the time is. But those are the tests teachers seem to like.
Yeah.
So how do you think about that?
I think that's true. I mean, what I was rejoicing about when we had the teacher panel was, in my view, what's happening today. It took a conversation about the quantity of testing to take that in some ways off the table to have a conversation about the quality of testing. The quality of testing is really the conversation that needs to be had, but in some ways we need to take off the table the quantity piece. And every time we try to have a quality conversation to say, let's bring teachers to the table to talk about what features of assessments they want to see, people would say, well, there's just too much or there's not enough. And so I think what we've been able to do today, or what you saw the teachers do, is say it's actually not about how much time. Joy said, we gave 1 state test a year, now we're going to give 2. I'm psyched to give 2 because it actually gives me the data that I need. So I see a shift in the conversation that comes from saying, you know what, the average, the mean across 32 districts, and that's just a starting point, is not egregiously high. It gives us a marker for some districts where it is egregiously high, at least to say, let's reflect on what we're doing.
Okay.
But it advances a conversation that's more about quality.
So Dave, you said you think there's too much time testing. So is that including these formative assessments? Are we giving too many of these things?
Well, I was talking about the summative. Whether there's too much formative or not is another question. I think the real question is what's of quality and what's of value. And that gets lost in policy because things are very complicated, and yet state law and policy tends to be pretty simplistic. So we pass a 3rd grade guarantee, or whatever the hell that is. What's that mean? In LA now, all kids are going to be reading at the 3rd grade level. I mean, you don't pass it with monies for professional development. You don't pass it with monies so that kids can have lunches and breakfast and psychological services and so forth. So we're in this very simplistic age. And let me just quickly talk about summative assessment. In our state, we didn't have any state summative assessment. It was all local. And then our law said you'll test everybody in grades 4, 4, 8, and 10. I amended that to be 4, 6, and 8 in math, 3, 5, 7 in language arts, and then of course the 10th grade test that Celine said you had to pass to get a high school diploma. That's a lot of testing on the state level. And as the teachers pointed out, from a practical point of view, you test little Johnny in the 4th grade, and his results come while the kid's in the 5th grade. So, what's the 5th grade teacher to do? What's the 4th grade teacher to do? But that was the system to at least get a sense. Along comes No Child Left Behind. It says you'll test everybody 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and once in high school. So it doubled our testing, and it doubled our testing time for summative assessment. And I think summative assessment is limited. So I think I think our panel is supposed to talk about the policy issues that need to come out of this. And I think there are 2. Number 1 is we have to look at the science. We always look at the art, never the science. So when you say formative assessments, I can say a lot of lousy formative assessments, and I can show you some good ones. What works and what's value for kids learning? And I think the more we shift to formative assessment, away from summative assessment, the better off we're going to be. And the second policy area is technology. I mean, there's a whole world out there. Never mind the issue that the teachers brought up, which is they don't have enough technology. Can you imagine any local bank or insurance company or large corporation standing in line waiting we have 1 computer for every 6 whatevers? I mean, come on. It's ridiculous. So if we could take advantage of the technology in a positive way, so I think that's what's missing. We had the debate about teaching to the test. Now, nobody worries about teaching to AP because it's good testing, right? But we worry about teaching to the test. So we have national debates about teaching to the test. MCAS caused teaching to the test. Well, that was a good thing, actually. So I think it's time to really look at true solutions and policies and a semblance of order. Right now, it's just knee-jerk. And we really are summatively testing way too much.
We're still talking about form. I mean, David made a really important point. A lot of what is masquerades under the name of being formative assessments these days is sort of really just mini summative assessments. And vendors put this on, districts want it, and so forth. And you really got to look at sort of what actually are these instruments, what are they being used for, and then what are teachers being given to be supported? Because a lot of times they're also administered, and then leave aside sort of how quickly you get the results, what kind of support are you getting in using them, and so forth. And those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking, not these broad sweep? Do we need summative versus formative? I mean, that's the kind of stuff. I mean, you can have a blog or a Twitter war about that, but it's meaningless in terms of actually designing a policy or supporting or figuring out how a district can better support its team.
But hold on, but it's
and Andy, if the effort to have good national, state-led assessments like Park and Smarter Balance and others, really were serious about putting the money behind it from a scientific perspective and not having it done on the cheap, making Park and Smarter Balance and others just backing off to really where it's not going to be as effective a test, you might have seen formative assessment actually built into the summative, I mean, which is the way to go, right? I mean, you give the summative assessment, then you rely on NWEA or DIBELS or whatever. Wouldn't it be nice to have a semblance of board? I have a whole system, by the way, developed by teachers and vested by teachers and tested by teachers. To
All right, well, let's pick that up. So that's right. That was originally the proposal for Park. They were going to have these assessments throughout the year, where they through something assessment
Through something.
through something
Through the
through
mirror.
something. They were through something, and so it would have been a common assessment every couple of months, and then you would have rolled up the results into the summative. Great idea. Problem was, people figured out that, wow, that is really going to start to dictate the scope and sequence of what schools have to do. And that now starts to sound an awful lot like a national curriculum. And by the way, how does this work for charter schools, for example, that are supposed to have a lot of flexibility and freedom over how they teach? And suddenly they know, well, you got plenty of freedom, except 6 weeks from now you're going to be tested on these items. And so they backed off. So again, I mean, it seems like these are, I mean, you're right, Andy, but we still have choices to make. So let me ask this one question. So do you think, Dave and others, you say we're doing too much summative assessment. Should we back away from annual assessments? Do we no longer need to do annual assessments, and we can figure out a way to get the teacher value added stuff some other way?
So ask the first question. Why do we have summative assessment in the first place? I mean, there was a good reason. We didn't have good data on how things were happening at a state level. And by the way, this idea that we were going to then publish results on NAEP and run it alongside state results it took 10 years for the outrage. I mean, one state, will remain unnamed, had 88% of its fourth grade kids proficient in math, when NAEP said 12% were. So that's, well, it depends on the year. So that's, so summative assessment is a good thing because it suggests that we're going to find out how a state is doing, how a district is doing, how a school is doing. That's a good thing. I just think we need to now rethink it. Do we have to test every school every year? Yeah, there's scientific ways of making sure that you're getting your assessment without having to do all of this 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You can do growth factors through things, but it takes the good science and technology, which we're not either willing to invest in or think through.
And it would take the Department of Education being willing to waive some of those key parts of No Child Left Behind to let people experiment. I mean, it's a very clear requirement.
Law.
Wow, Dave and I are talking crazy. You mean Congress would pass a law?
Well, they passed it in the first place.
Yeah.
To double my testing.
You don't spend enough time in Washington, Dave. If you think they're going to get around to passing a law, that'd be crazy. No, you're right. They could pass a law.
So let me tell you about Washington. Back when President Bush got elected, the second Bush, all the stars were lined up, Ted Kennedy, John Boehner, whatever, and they passed a law. I mean, that was great, right? Everybody got along, so they passed a law. Well, that's the law we're suffering from.
Yeah.
So having everybody agree on a law with all of its warts isn't necessarily worse than having a dysfunctional Washington. In fact, I kind of like it. They're not getting anything done. You can't bother.
You say you're not a big fan of the Farm Bill. Right.
I'm not.
Look at that Farm Bill. There you go.
It depends on what they tucked in the Farm Bill. I haven't seen it all yet.
All right. Okay. The teachers, very spontaneously, we did not plant this. We're very positive about Common Core. Though we will be sharing that with our friends at the Gates Foundation in our next funding proposal. No, I'm just kidding. All right. But the question on the Common Core is this going to change everything? Is this finally going to get us to the point where the assessments, Park and Smarter Balance especially, are so much better than anything we've had before? It really is going to encourage the kind of teaching and learning that we all want to see in the classroom. I mean, are you still hopeful about that promise? Anybody?
Well, you mixed two things. You said Common Core and then you said the assessment. So the answer is certainly from my perspective, the Common Core is fine. writing the standards is not the hard part, although give them a lot of credit. It's implementing them. So that's the first issue. And then the assessments have to match. So it's complicated. One would hope that both assessments will be good and what other assessments tie to it. So yes, if we can develop good, strong standards finally to be used nationwide, and a good assessment with it, it will be a huge step forward, absolutely. And I think it's encouraging, by the way, with all the foolish politics that goes on when you raise standards. People are against it for the craziest reasons. I love to watch CNN or one of these where they have some parents stand up and talk about the communistic aspects of it or whatever. And you know they haven't read them. You know they haven't read them. So I think that's the real damaging part of this whole debate. It's not about what the debate should be about.
So, go ahead.
Can I just say real briefly, we, as I outlined at the beginning, have worked with teachers to kind of distill down 5 main points that we hear from teachers in terms of what they want in terms of test quality. And I think there's some hope and some remaining optimism that the Common Core assessments can still get us to that place. So alignment to curriculum, you would be appalled to hear how many teachers are still having to administer tests that have nothing to do with the curriculum they teach. Mm-hmm. That is a very fair frustration that should be addressed by this point. I think teachers are hopeful Common Core will address that. Measuring the ability of very high and very low below grade level students. There's hope there. Same with getting the results back more quickly, same with asking more complex questions and giving something to help you figure out how to improve from what you have. And so I think a lot of the hope that teachers have in Common Core and in the coming assessments is surrounded by will they address, and I'm hopeful that they will address the things that I see as challenges now, and I hope that they will. When I hear things like the backing off on formative assessments, I would say, why can't we in a district look at, I think there's a district saying, both there's the, is this a national mandate and a national mandated scope and sequence? And there are also districts saying, I already give 25 hours of testing a year, I can't layer on more. Mm-hmm. But I would urge those districts to say, listen, pull together a group of teachers at each grade level, look at the actual assessments. I bet there are a lot of teachers, if the assessments are strong and formative assessments aligned to Parker Smarter Balanced, they would say, scrap the rest and go with that, because that's going to give me what I need to improve, and these are measuring the right things with the right types of higher order questions.
Yeah. So Andy, this question about test prep, I think George Miller, I saw the other day, gave an interview, and he said he was surprised by what had happened under No Child Left Behind, all this focus on the test, and drill and kill. And we all know, nobody wanted that to happen. And we've all been in debates, and we've said, well, you can't blame the law for people behaving stupidly, and that's all true, but it's widespread, it appears. And it appears that a lot of schools out there reverted to that kind of fear-based, oh my God, we got to raise the scores, so we just have to double down on test prep.
Well, this is the problem, Mike. I mean, look, we can't even have an honest conversation about this stuff, the capacity in the system. And so you overlaid, and No Child Left Behind, for all the sort of hype about it, what Clinton did in '94 was like much more of a sea change, telling states to have standards. All we did in 2001 is tell them you actually got to make them meaningful and do something with them. There was an increase in testing, but it was really just about you're going to have to hold schools accountable, not just sort of on your own whim, but you actually have to set some targets and mm-hmm. timelines and so forth. And what we quickly found out is the political system doesn't have the tensile strength to handle that. And we've seen that play out. This system is just not a system that really readily embraces accountability. And so play that forward to Common Core. What we've essentially said is, okay, these relatively modest state standards, which in most places were relatively modest, you couldn't even hold yourselves accountable for that. So now what we're going to do is have these new standards, which really are a sea change in terms of their expectations, what they expect from teachers, what they expect from students, and so forth. And somehow that's going to be widely embraced. I mean, it really is. It's like a couple that's like in a really terrible relationship that's not going well, and they say, you know what will make this relationship better? We should have a baby. That will help. This has immediately gone to like this exponentially more complicated level when we couldn't even handle the basic level. And so this is the teaching to the test. that is a low capacities systems response to heightened performance expectations. You're going to see the exact same thing with Common Core if we don't get serious about talking about the capacity. And that's some hard conversations about instructional quality. It's some hard that people, on the left have trouble with. It's some hard conversations about resources and funding that people on the right have trouble with. And so I think if there's a reason to be worried about Common Core, it's not these episodic things like this three-ring circus in New York and so forth. It's this underlying problem of the political system just cannot bring itself to get serious about doing what it needs to really improve our schools. And that more than any of this temporal stuff is the real risk to Common Core.
But when you, fundamentally, when you talk about capacity, do you mean these schools, they feel the pressure and they literally do not know what to do? Like they don't have the expertise to respond in a more positive way.
There's a reason some schools don't turn testing into this be-all, end-all. They deliver high-quality instruction. They shave off the rough edges. And this is not like charter schools or private schools or public schools. There are schools in all sectors that do well with this. There are schools in all sectors that do terrible with this. There's a reason for that, and they tend to be high-capacity places. For one reason or another, they've been able to develop that. Low-capacity schools do this deadening stuff, and they stress out about it. All the things that drives you crazy as a parent, they're the stuff you see because they're worried about it. It's how they're acting. I mean, you go into schools where there's no consequences for the kids with the tests, just for the adults, and yet the kids they're stressed out. They've got everybody wearing the same color T-shirt, all this kind of crap. I mean, that's how a low-capacity system responds to a challenge, and good schools just don't do this.
So, Mike, I totally agree. To me, I use the word distractions. Baby would be a hell of a distraction. It's distractions, right? We love distractions. I mean, you try not to go down a path of reform, and you can guarantee somebody has a distraction to throw at you. So I remember telling my secretary, boy, you better clear my schedule. When we jumped to first in the country, I said, they're going to be knocking down my door in these 49 other states to do what we did in Massachusetts. I didn't have a one. Because what we did, and it wasn't me, it was based on the leadership and the consistency, no distractions. So we're going to set high standards. We're going to let the teachers be involved. We're going to give them money. Remember, we had a lot of money thrown out there, a lot of money for professional development, a lot of money for teacher salaries, etc. And we're going to stick with it. And that's what we did, no distractions. So this issue of teaching to the test was just another distraction. That turned out not to be a huge case in Massachusetts because guess what? Those people that taught to the test didn't get the kind of sustained results. The ones that did, and of course we took all the schools that outperformed what you would expect, and most of them were in the urban areas. Bill Edgerly gave money, $10,000 of his own money to 10 schools. We had Vanguard schools, you remember, Celine. All of these schools that just knocked it out of the park, we went and said, are you teaching to the test? And the answer was no. We're understanding the standards and we're incorporating them in what we're doing. And by the way, it's about engaged kids. And so good activities and so forth and so on. So I agree with Andy. We get all these sideshows. I mean, it's disgusting what's going on in all these states. It's a sideshow. It's a political sideshow. And I am so thrilled, and people ought to note that something like 70% of the teachers in America support the Common Core. And that's because good to great teachers don't mind good things being done as long as it's consistent. They don't mind being held accountable. And I'll use the example of, I don't worry about the growth. If you get growth, we have a system that'll say, you got growth, you got growth. What I worry about, there's little Johnny in your class, and it's mostly in urban areas, whose parents get divorced or who's whatever in September, and the kid goes for a dive. Now, is the teacher responsible for that? Well, over time, if we use the science and we stay and don't have the distraction, we can use it as one factor for teacher evaluation. But I agree with Andy, it's all the distractions. Can't we just draw it up and stick with it? No one ever does.
Well, David, your point another. Oh, go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to kind of add to what you both said and say this kind of gets to one of the questions that we weren't able to answer and may build further research around, which is this question of prep and teaching to the test for how does that all play itself out? And we actually felt like we couldn't credibly measure it. We know that some teachers like some of the ones on the panel who talk about having a period every day to prep for tests. Like there's one side where you can say we spend tons of time on test prep, and it's easy to quantify from a teacher's point of view how much time I spend on test prep. Then we had teachers at the far other end of the spectrum. And when you ask the question, how much time does prep take? They say, well, 180 days all day I teach. That prepares the kids for the test. And so we couldn't figure out how to credibly ask a question that actually got to, what is bad prep, in fact. Like when someone on the panel talked about learning keyboarding skills and learning to type, and that actually is not a bad thing for a kid to learn. So what are the things that are distractions? What are the things that are just for the sake of test taking? That's the question that needs to get asked next. And we felt like it was so complex, and there's such a range of what exists out there, that all we could do was say, minute by minute, how long does it take you to give a test, and kind of surface the disparity between what district administrators were reporting and what teachers really experienced.
Yeah, so many good points. Dave, I do have to ask you one question. When you talk about, just staying focused and avoiding all these distractions, do you think the teacher evaluation stuff is a distraction, or is it the next logical step in this standards-based reform?
Well, all of these things have merit. Third grade guarantees have merit. It's just that they tend to become both victims of distractions and silver bullets. Quick fixes. We're going to get rid of all the teachers by, bad teachers by just having the system. So I think it's like everything else, Michael. If it was a thoughtful approach, as our whole law was, remember, our law wasn't just about testing and assessment. It had about standards and assessment, a whole series of things. I think if teacher evaluation was looked at holistically, and then you stay with it, then we'd be all right. But immediately people say, well, teacher's going to get fired because the kids didn't do well, and so forth and so on. Teacher evaluation is probably the worst part of human resources in all of. You talk to any teacher 5 years ago and ask how they get evaluated, and they're lucky if the principal comes in 20 minutes, so forth and so on. So it's an area that had to get addressed. 99% of teachers getting rated good or great in the country is ridiculous. So it had to get addressed. It's just that, again, we're not able to put a system in place and stick with it, with all of these variations that you need, and that just doesn't happen. It gets jerked around, and there's state laws come and so forth.
We should be careful, though. With the thing, the problem with the Massachusetts example is also Massachusetts started from a place with a pretty good public school system, a pretty good traditional public schools. There's very few states. You look at what happened in Massachusetts economically. There's very few states that have survived multiple industries leaving and have then been able to attract new industries. So like Michigan is trying to do this with one industry falling apart, whereas Massachusetts has been able to do it with textiles, they've been able to do it with manufacturing, and there's just a base there. And again, I'll use that word, capacity. And the problem, and David sort of got at it, that example of that student who's not doing well. In a rational system, you combine data with human judgment and so forth. In our system, it's very hard to do that. The unions are not sort of often left field when they say we don't trust managerial discretion because there's a lot of bad management. Like, that's actually a fairly defensible statement, right? So then we go and we then try to develop these metrics and so forth. They've got their own problems, and what we're dancing around the whole time is just a low capacity system. And so I think David's exactly right about how you need to do this, you need to stick with it, but you can only do that if you have a system that's got the ability to do these things.
But let's keep pushing on the low capacity piece. Okay, so what exactly does that mean then? What do we do to make it more likely that more schools out there will respond thoughtfully to the pressure from Common Core, for example? Is it money? Is it more training?
It's the problem. You do multiple things at once. You need to address the situation where you're meeting it. So policymakers need to be serious about how are you going to support teachers? What are you going to do with training, and more than just the train the trainers model and the stuff? How are you seriously going to provide this support? That means resources and so forth. And people like to talk about how much we spend, and we do spend a lot, but that money's tacked down. And so for a lot of these things, it just necessitates new resources just because of the way the money flows. So you have to do all those things. And then you'd also get serious about the pipeline. You'd say, what do we need to do to change the human capital pipeline? What do you need to do to really get serious about how we train credentialed teachers, school leaders, and so forth? And we don't, again, we dance around the margins of that. We don't do any of that. And honestly, we might as well be honest about it, in part because we have this terrible climate of intellectual McCarthyism in this field. And if you raise these issues, you just get attacked and you get browbeaten and so forth. And so people just sort of lay off. And it keeps us, we don't, in this field, talk honestly about some of the really serious core problem. We can't even talk about sort of data becomes personal. How can you say that if you're just looking at a data point's not a personal attack. A data point's a data point.
So-
and so we came into the field. It's a very unhealthy dialogue at a time when we need to be doing multiple things at once if we're going to be serious about doing this. And again, and what you're going to hear, I worry, in a few years, is what you heard on the first panel. The people who are actually in charge of implementing this policy, teachers, and you heard, if they're involved in Teach Plus, these are exceptional teachers. You're going to hear their frustration. They've been put out there. They're dealing with all this dysfunction. They haven't been supported and so forth. That we're going to hear the same thing about Common Core. The verbiage will be different, but you'll be hearing the same sort of frustrations and so forth play out.
So Celine, I mean, to put a more positive spin on it, I mean, when you go into schools that are working, that have this capacity, I mean, how has that come to be? Like when you find teachers that you work with that feel like their schools are really doing it. I mean, is it just the normal thing we always hear? They had a great leader. And...
Well, I think it's multiple layers. I think a great leader certainly helps. I think for the teacher community, I think there are ways to get the teacher community involved in some of this decision making that we see very rarely. That could happen much more. Teachers aren't psychometricians, but they absolutely, if you said to those indie teachers who have their I-STEP test that is failing them, here are some other examples of state tests. Here are both PARCC and SMART are balanced. Like, let's pull together a group of all of the third grade teachers in the city who are interested, or, a small subgroup, or however you want to do it, and say, let's actually let you, figure out which among these three, state level assessments can be given. They actually probably would have something tremendous to say, the right rationale, and be able to kind of make those links between what's been developed and what's going to make sense in their classroom. And so I feel like now is a really important moment to involve teachers and say, let's empower you in that decision making, and then on the back end hold you accountable. Say, you said smarter balanced was the best way for us to go, and we ditched the I-STEP and we didn't go PARCC and we went smarter balanced. And there were thousands of teachers involved in that decision, and a lead group of 25 teachers who led this transition and really analyzed the tests and what they mean for students. That's very possible, and we operate in a system right now that disenfranchises teachers and says, well, you're not a psychometrician, so you don't get to be in the conversation about assessment. And then, surprise, surprise, they're frustrated with the assessments that they give. Yeah. So there's a lot of bridging to be done there. Yeah,
and the same is true of teacher evaluation. I mean, I mentioned 99% of teachers are rated good or great. So the reaction was, well, we got to get rid of those bad teachers. We know there's all these bad teachers. We got to get rid of them. No one pays any attention to the role of the principal and whether they've been trained to truly evaluate, et cetera. That's a whole part of our really culture in public education. That they're just not trained. You'd ask any principal, they're not properly trained through their training program and so forth to be very good evaluators. I mean, one of the things that we did was adopt National Institute for School Leaders. We had 1,200 urban teachers taught. And I hope to think that many of them became good leaders and knew how to work with their staff. That's a huge missing piece across the country.
All right, we are going to get the audience in this in just a moment. So if you have a question, Claudio, always you, Claudio. Oh, sure. Hold the NPR rank again. I'm just kidding. But if anybody has a question, and also out there, please tweet your questions to the hashtag #TimeOnTesting. I am looking at them right now. By the way, you guys have provided some great fodder for Twitter. It has been going wild here, so good job with that. That is always a goal of ours, so appreciate that. Let me ask one last moderator question. It's something that we care a lot about here at Fordham, which is this question of reading, right? Again, get to the capacity. In the No Child Left Behind era, you could argue we've made pretty significant gains in math, certainly at 4th and 8th grade levels, and really in the era of test-based accountability, less so in reading. I mean, you can see some bumps for the lowest performing kids. That might be because of better teaching around decoding and things, but not much. And one theory, the sort of E.D. Hirsch theory, is that it is because we are not teaching young kids the content knowledge that they need for their reading comprehension. And many of us have been saying for years, the elementary school curriculum, we've got to bring back history and science and art and music and geography. And that's how the reading scores are going to be. But instead, we look at the school level, and it appears that, if anything, they've just doubled down on the reading skills. So again, is this just a low capacity thing? And how do we solve this one? How do we just get this information out to schools that says teaching reading is teaching content?
So I hate to keep touting us, but we do lead the country for a reason.
Yes, Dave, all right.
You know.
Do you lead them by leaps and bounds or a few points?
Well,
Yeah, all right.
And by the
second
way,
only to Shanghai in 8th grade science.
there has
But-
been some plateauing since Dave Driscoll left this commission.
So, you know, again, talk about distractions. I mean, you know, all you have to do is have a food fight over phonics versus whole language, and on it goes. We did settle it in Massachusetts, and I think and thankfully, a lot of states, Wisconsin, Connecticut, New Hampshire, North Carolina, a few others, have adopted our Foundations of Reading test. And if you unpack it, it will talk about the various elements of teaching reading. Not from this political, ideological way, but looking at the context of both content and context and the skills needed and so forth. So I think it's an area that, again, science can play a role. What is it that kids need? There's been enough studies about the brain and other things as to how kids respond. So I just think this is another area of complete distraction. And if you want to start, grab our Foundations of Reading test and work backwards and develop a curriculum.
I don't think that's quite. I think again, you get back to this capacity problem. I mean, I'm in the E.D. Hirsch camp. Like, I mean, and first of all, there was no golden era where kids were getting this in high poverty schools. There was music and art and geography, and then we came along and took it away, and we talk about it like that. And it's just a ridiculous way to talk about it. These schools have never been good at this, and what they're doing now is they're drilling down on these skills, and you're left asking, you know, what are these kids reading? If they're not reading about, if you're taking all these things off the table, they're not getting history, they're not getting English, they're not getting social studies, you know, they're not getting sports. So then what are they reading about? And what you actually see is they're reading really sanitized, you know, awful stuff. And so it's not surprising that it turns kids off from reading. But again, this is what low capacity schools do. Good schools and good teachers know how to address this. And we, you know, again, as you know, if you want a sort of a case study in our problem with political tensile strength, we had a $1 billion program to help schools do this better, and you may have noticed it's not around anymore.
Yep. Okay, Claudio. Yes, and wait for the microphone and speak up so that we get you on the webcast.
Your thoughts about the future of NAEP in the post-Common Core world. Will it still be the gold standard? Will it still be used to essentially keep states honest about where they are?
Yeah, I mean, Dave, one way to cut time on testing is let's just get rid of the NAEP. I mean, come on. No?
So, first of all, it has to remain the gold standard. So whatever gets tested has to be of high quality. We, as you know, there's been some publicity about it. We've been caught up in the sequestration and so forth. We've had to make some adjustments to our schedule, not testing civics and so forth. A lot of people say, well, if the PAC and Smarter Balanced are successful, what do we need NAEP for? Well, I'll even concede that, although I think we're always going to be the independent verifier. PAC and Smarter Balanced will only replace NAEP, even be considered to replace NAEP, if their results mirror state NAEP. So if 26% of kids are currently proficient in Illinois, and PAC says 45 are, it will lose credibility. So first of all, we're always going to be the independent verifier. Secondly, people forget what we do. We don't just do math and reading. We do civics and the arts and geography. And when we're starting a new TEL test, we provide a lot of information about background questions that are asked of kids. We provide long-term trend. And here's your lesson for today, folks, being an old math teacher. Simpson's paradox. Did you ever hear of it? So it says that all parts of the system rise, but the whole system doesn't rise. That's Simpson's paradox. And that's what's happened in America. Very interesting. We've been testing, and it's not 8th graders, it's 13-year-olds, interestingly, since 1972 in math and reading in America. And what we've learned is that all subgroups have gained. Blacks, Hispanics, everyone has gained. The problem is the gain for blacks and Hispanics, and blacks and Hispanics are now performing as whites did 20 years ago. There's some good news based in NAEP, by the way. The problem is 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, it was almost all white kids. So that high performing population has shrunk. and the population, obviously, of Black and Hispanic has gotten much bigger. So you're getting growth, but from lower performing groups. That's the Simpsons paradox. That's the paradox.
And not at the 17-year-old level, unfortunately, not as much.
That is correct.
Yeah.
So I think NAEP will always be around, assuming Congress appropriates it, and our need is probably going to increase, not decrease.
Okay, other questions on Twitter or here in person? Yes, wait for the microphone, please. Keep it relatively short because we got some beer and wine over there.
All right. Well, I really agree with the thoughts that it takes high-capacity schools to use assessment thoughtfully. Can any of you, speak more to this idea of improving the human capital pipeline for teachers and school leaders?
Teach Plus.
Well, yeah, I will.
Nice one.
I will make a quick plug for our T3 program, which kind of fills a gap in the human capital pipeline. So we focus a lot on bringing great teachers into the profession. We focus a lot on pulling them out to become leaders. We focus very little on building a kind of career in teaching that allows a second stage for highly effective teachers. In our T3 program, we take teacher leaders at different grade levels and subjects and allow them to work with their peers to build the capacity of their peers. It's very much around standards and around assessments and looking at assessment data to refine practice. And so I think those kinds of things that kind of institutionally put a role for excellent teachers as leaders of their peers are an important kind of middle step.
Great. Andy, can I push on you a little bit more? It's really because of that zinger earlier about some of our ideas. No, but so it feels a little circular here. We say, okay, we're going to we need accountability because we have these bad schools and we need to hold them accountable. But the bad schools that don't have capacity are going to respond to accountability in not productive ways. So what we really need is more capacity. So why don't we just skip the accountability and just do capacity?
Because first of all, without the accountability, pretty quickly your monkey's throwing darts and trying to figure out what schools and where to target your efforts. But I mean, the answer again, it gets back to this. There's got to be a give on the political right and the political left. It takes resources, but it takes resources spent. We just spent $3.5 billion trying to turn around low-performing schools, and it turns out if you go into low-performing schools and you do stuff that's not really aggressive, they remain low-performing schools. Did we really need $3.5 billion to learn that lesson? Arguably not, but that was sort of the only way. No one was really willing to bite the bullet and say you could only get this money if you're doing really aggressive things. So we flirt around the edges with these things. We don't sort of take them head on. And I mean, to the earlier question about the human capital pipeline, I mean, can anyone honestly say, does anyone want to make the case in this room that we have an honest conversation in this country about teacher quality, about the quality of preparation institutions? I'm on the board of 2 ed schools. I'm not hostile to them, but we don't talk honestly about teacher preparation in this country and the quality. And so if anybody wants to make that case, the floor is yours. And if you want to really tackle this problem, we've got to start to be able to do that. And so capacity becomes the word we use. It's a euphemism. We got to be able to start actually talking about these problems. Or as I said, we're gonna be right back here. And so it's not. You're right. It ends up being circular, but it's not inherently circular. Mm-hmm. It's because of sort of our inability politically to take these issues on. And we shouldn't pick on education too much. It's not as if the political system's working well in all these other sectors, and we're the laggard. But you see it acutely here, given the need and so forth.
And look, and I think you could make a case. We definitely need the transparency. Whether we need these stakes and we're going to go through this thing where we're going to close down bad schools or maybe not. Or again, you don't want the monkeys throwing the darts. You don't want them trying to turn around bad schools.
What's the example where states have done this without pressure on them? I mean, what's the example of where states have actually really done anything for underserved kids without federal pressure on them?
Right. Okay. Question in the back.
So in terms of
gotta get the mic.
related to the high capacity schools, I was just wondering, the human capital is very important. By the way, in LA, we just started a Teach Prep working group, and I think that's a very big issue we have to start working on because our teacher preparation programs are cash cows, and we need to raise the bar. Common Core implementation is not going to be done unless there's coordination between universities and school districts. But anyways, getting back to my question, high capacity schools, I'm wondering if also social capital makes those schools, if that is a contributing factor to the reason why those schools are high capacity. I think human capital is important, but what about social capital?
Yep. Anybody?
Well, I think when you see, I think you're exactly right. The other thing we don't talk honestly in this country about is that different kids need different things. I mean, Edie Hirsch talks that's sort of a core tenet if he talks about. Now we don't talk about that, and schools struggle with this, and you see this, and you see all kinds of ineffective programs that are kept around in the name of political correctness. You see people struggle with this. Another thing we don't do a good job on. So good schools realize that you're right. Social capital plays a role, but social capital is not an immutable fact of life, and there's things schools can do to level the playing field.
All right, one last question here from Twitter. Thank you. Caitlin Hannon says, I'm hearing a lot about state tests. What can districts do tomorrow to start to fix assessment? Any ideas concretely on what districts can do? Celine is free.
Well, my first one would be go to assessment advisor, and if you're looking for formative assessments, look at the way teachers have rated formative assessments and have conversations with teachers in your district.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts?
Well, just make sure that that you as a district understand what you want kids to know and be able to do. Your debate with Andy, I would cut you both in half.
Which half?
Well, I would cut your arguments. I would cut your arguments in half and then maybe cut them in half again. I think, for example, in Boston, as Celine well knows, Teach Plus had a role in this. The poorest performing school in Boston is now one of the highest performing, Orchard Gardens, and there's a whole story there. But that wasn't a case of pouring more money in or anything else. So there are these examples where capacity can be developed through good leadership, strong teachers, knowing where you want to go. So districts, that's a school that basically said, okay, these are the standards. We're gonna adopt them, and we're gonna just focus on them. So I think that's what a district has to do. Get with the game. Your job, whether the state screws up or not, is to see to it that as many kids as possible are getting where they need to get. So you do that through standards, knowing what you're doing.
Well, knowing what
so
you're
go
doing.
to work.
One of the
Don't
most
wait for the
interesting-
state, that's for sure.
One of those interesting parts of this interesting report was the gap between district-reported testing and teacher-reported testing. And I mean, a fundamental basic tenet if you're going to have any kind of performance management is you need to know what you're doing and why. And it's clear in a lot of places that even though the overall testing is less than you hear, they still don't know exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so, like, if you're a school system leader, that's probably one of the first things you really need to get a handle on if you're going to tackle this problem.
That is all the time we have. Please join me in thanking our great panel and our panel of teachers earlier. Please do tell all your friends and colleagues that this video of this event will be online at edexcellence.net almost immediately. You can also go back and read all the Twitter action, which was kind of fun, at Time on Testing. And finally, on February 20th here at Fordham, we are going to have another panel on teacher quality, this one expanding access to great teachers. We're going to look at a recent report we came out with about right-sizing the classroom, how to take some of our best teachers and get them in front of more kids. Mike Hansen, Jean-Claude Brizard, Linda Donaldson Guidi, Brian Hassel, be here February 20th. Thank you very much.